He made the traveller sit down again, stepped up to the machine and began. "As you see, the harrow follows the human form. Here is the harrow for the upper body. Here are harrows for the legs. All there is for the head is this one little spike. Do you understand?" He leaned forward and smiled encouragingly at the traveller, prepared to give the most detailed explanations. The traveller looked at the harrow with wrinkled brow. The information about the methods of the court had left him unsatisfied. And then again, he had to remind himself this was a penal colony. Certain rules obtained, and military discipline evidently had to be kept tight. In addition, he put a little hope in the character of the new commandant, who clearly, albeit slowly, intended to reform the whole process, whatever the views of this particular narrow-minded officer. Reaching his point in his thinking, the traveller asked, "Will the commandant attend the execution?" "I'm not sure," said the officer, caught off balance by the direct question, and his encouraging smile was distorted. "That's one more reason why we have to hurry. I will even, I'm sorry to say, have to curtail my explanations somewhat, but then I would simply supply further information tomorrow once the machine has been cleaned. The fact that it gets so dirty is really its only drawback. So, just the bare essentials from here on. When the man is lying on the bed, and the bed has begun to tremble, the harrow is lowered onto his body. It automatically adjusts itself so that it barely grazes his body with the tips of its needles. The distance once established, the steel rope tautens into a pole, and then the performance begins. Of course, someone without the necessary background would notice no difference in the punishments. The harrow does more or less the same job. Trembling, it sticks its points into the body lying on the bed, which is itself trembling. To make it possible for anyone to view the way the sentence is carried out, the harrow is made of glass. Fitting the needles to it gave us considerable technical headaches, as you might imagine, but after many attempts the difficulties have been surmounted. We shirked no effort, and now anyone can see through the glass the way the inscription is made on the body. Would you like to step near and see the needles for yourself?" The traveller slowly got to his feet, walked over, and leaned down over the harrow. "You see," the officer continued, "needles in many positions, but always in pairs. Each long one has a short one next to it. It's the long one that writes, and the short one squirts water to wash off the blood, so that the writing is always clearly legible. The mixture of water and blood is conducted into these little runnels, and finally flows into this principal runnel, which feeds the drainage pipe into the pit here." The officer's finger sketched the route the blood and water mixture had to follow, when in an effort to make it as clear as possible, the officer cupped his hands at the end of the drainage pipe. The traveller lifted his head, and with one hand put out behind him, groped his way back to his chair. Then he saw to his horror that the condemned man had also followed the officer's invitation to inspect the harrow from close to. He had dragged the sleepy soldier along a short way on the chain and was leaning down over the glass. One could see him looking with his uncertain eyes for what the two gentlemen had just studied, and how, because he didn't have an explanation, he was unable to make sense of it. He bent over this way and that. Repeatedly he ran his eyes over the glass. The traveller wanted to drive him back, because what he was doing was probably punishable, but the officer with one hand restrained the traveller, and with the other picked up a lump of earth from the rampart and threw it at the soldier. His head jerked up. He saw what the condemned man had dared to do, dropped his rifle, dug his heels into the ground and yanked at the chain, whereby the condemned man fell over. Then he stood over the man as he writhed on the ground, jangling his chains. "Pick him up!" yelled the officer, because he noticed that the traveller was becoming unhelpfully distracted by the condemned man. The traveller even leaned down past the harrow, just to see what was going on with the condemned man. "Treat him gently," yelled the officer. He ran round the machine, picked up the condemned man under his arms, and after several stumbles finally got him upright with some help from the soldier. "Well, I suppose I know everything now," said the traveller, as the officer came back to him. "Everything except the most important thing of all," he replied. took the traveller by the arm and pointed up. There, in the engraver, is the mechanism which governs the movement of the harrow, and that mechanism is set according to drawings of the various possible judgments. I still use the drawings made by the previous commandant. Here they are. He took a few sheets from the leather folder. I'm afraid I can't give them to you to look at. They are the most precious things I have. Sit down, I'll show you a few. From this distance, you'll be able to have quite a good view. He showed him the first page. The traveller would have liked to say something complimentary, but all he saw were labyrinthine criss-crossing lines that covered the paper so thickly that it was hard to see any white space at all. "Read it," said the officer. I can't," said the traveller. "But it's perfectly clear," said the officer. "It's very artful," said the traveller, evasively, "but I'm afraid I can't decipher it." "Ha!" said the officer, and he laughed and took back the folder. "Well, it's no primary school calligraphy, that's for sure. It does take a long time to read. I'm sure you would eventually be able to decipher it. Of course, the writing mustn't be too straightforward. It's not supposed to be fatal straight away, but only after an interval of 12 hours or so on average. The turning point occurs after about 6, and many ornaments surround the script proper. The actual text is traced around the body like a narrow belt. The rest of the body is set aside for decoration. Are you now able to grasp the work of the harrow and the whole apparatus? Take a look." He jumped on the ladder, turned a wheel, and called down, "Watch out, step aside," and it started up. Had it not been for the squeaking of the wheel, it would have been majestic. As though surprised by the annoying wheel, the officer waved his fist at it, and then spread his arms apologetically towards the traveller, and quickly climbed down to watch the working of the machine from below. Something was still amiss, discernible only to him. He climbed back up, reached into the interior of the engrave with both hands, then, to get down quicker instead of using the ladder, he slid down one of its poles, and to make himself heard, screamed excitedly into the traveller's ear. "Do you understand the procedure? The harrow is starting to write. Once it's completed the first phase of writing on the man's back, the cotton wool roll comes down and slowly turns the body onto its side to offer clean space to the harrow. At the same time, the raw parts, already inscribed, are pressed against the cotton wool. Its special finish immediately staunches the bleeding and prepares the surface for a deepening of the writing. The jagged edges of the harrow here strip the cotton wool off the wounds as the body is further rotated, and drop it into the trench, and then the harrow gets to work again. Its script steadily deepens over 12 hours. For the first 6 of them, the condemned man lives almost as before, only he experiences pain. After 2 hours, the felt is taken away because the man has no strength left with which to scream. In the electrically heated dish here, at the head end, some warm rice porridge is put, at which the man, if he likes, can lap with his tongue. No one ever passes up the chance. At least I don't know of anyone, and I've seen plenty. It's only in about the 6th hour that he loses his relish for food. I'm usually kneeling down here, watching for this to happen. The man rarely swallows his last morsel. He turns it in his mouth and spits it into the trench. I need to duck, otherwise I would get hit in the face. But how quiet the man comes to be in the 6th hour. The very dimness of them begins to understand. You see it in the eyes. From there it starts to spread. A sight that might seduce one to take one's place under the harrow as well. Nothing more happens, but the man begins to decipher the script. He purses his lips as if he were listening. As you've seen, it's not easy to decipher the script with one's eyes. Our man deciphers it with his wounds. Admittedly, it's hard work and takes 6 more hours to complete. At the end of that time, the harrow pierces him through and tosses him into the pit, where the body smacks down on the bloody water and cotton wool. That concludes the judgment, and we, the soldier, and myself, shovel some earth over him." The traveller had inclined his ear to the officer, and with his hands in his pockets, he watched the machine at work. The condemned man watched too, but without comprehension. He stooped down a little to follow the wavering needles, when on a sign from the officer, the soldier from behind cut through his shirt and trousers so that they dropped off him. He was reaching for them to cover his nakedness, but the soldier lifted him up in the air and shook off the last of his rags. The officer switched off the machine, and in the new silence the condemned man was laid under the harrow. His chains were taken off him, and he was strapped on instead. Initially, it struck the condemned man as an improvement. Then the harrow dipped a little, because the man was lean. When the needle points touched him, a shudder passed over his skin. While the soldier was busy with his right hand, he put out his left, not knowing where to, but he was straight at the traveller. The officer kept gazing at the traveller from the side, as though trying to read in his expression what impression the execution, which he had, however superficially, explained to him, was making on him. The strap for the man's wrist broke. Presumably, the soldier had drawn it too tight. The soldier held up the broken strap, requiring the officer's help. The officer went over to him, facing the traveller the while, and said, "The machine has a great many moving parts. Every so often something in it is bound to break or tear, but that shouldn't affect one's overall sense of its performance. A strap is easily replaced. I'm going to have to use a chain, though admittedly it will have an adverse effect on the precision of the vibrations where the right arm is concerned." And while he chained the arm, he added, "However, the means to preserve the machine are severely diminished. Under the previous commandant, there was a fund ring-fenced for the purpose, to which I had free access. There was a storehouse containing all sorts of spares. I must confess I was spoiled, and I used to be quite wasteful with the materials earlier. You understand, not any more. Whatever the new commandant claims, he's just set on doing everything possible differently. So now he sees keeping the machine funds under his own supervision, and if I ask for a new strap, the old broken one is demanded by way of proof, and then the replacement doesn't come for another 10 days, and the quality is terrible, and it's basically useless. And as for how I'm supposed to run the machine in the meantime, well, that's not their concern, is it?" The traveller reflected. Intervening in other people's affairs is always fraught with risks. He wasn't a citizen of the penal colony, or of the state to which it belonged. If he wanted to condemn this execution, or even seek to obstruct it, he laid himself open to the objection, "You're a stranger. What do you know?" To which he would have to reply, at most, he could have added that he was a little surprised at himself, because he was travelling with the desire to see things for himself, and not at all to meddle in foreign notions of justice. Here, though, things looked rather enticing. The injustice of the procedure and the inhumanity of the execution were incontestable. No one could claim any self-interest on the part of the traveller, because the condemned man was a stranger to him, not a compatriot, and by no means a sympathetic fellow either. The traveller himself carried letters from high officials, had been received here with great politeness, and the fact that he had been asked to witness this execution even seemed to suggest that his opinion on this justice was being sought. This was all the more probable, as the commandant, as he had already heard, almost ad nauseam, was no advocate of this justice, and seemed to be behaving almost as a personal enemy of the officer. At that moment the traveller heard the officer give a cry of rage. He had just, not without some trouble, forced the felt knob into the condemned man's mouth, when the condemned man closed his eyes in a spasm of nausea and vomited. Hastily the officer snatched him up from the knob into the air to turn his head to the pit, but it was too late, and the spew was already all over the machine. "All the commandant's fault!" screamed the officer, and shook the brass rods in a fury. "The way the machine is being treated like a cowshed!" With shaking hands he showed the traveller what had happened. "And haven't I just spent hours trying to get the commandant to understand that prisoners shouldn't be fed on the eve of an execution? But no, with their new mild approach they do things differently. The commandant's lady stuffed the man full of sugary sweet things on the eve of his marching off. All his life he's fed on stinking fish, and now he's made to eat confectionery. But hey, why not? I wouldn't really have any objections. But why have I not got a new felt? As I've been asking for the past 3 months. How can a man take that felt in his mouth without nausea anyway, when over 100 men have sucked and bitten on it in their death throes? The condemned man had dropped his head again and looked calm. The soldier was busy swabbing the machine with the condemned man's shirt. The officer went over to the traveller, who, half suspecting something, had taken a step back, but the officer took him by the hand and pulled him aside. "I'd like to have a word with you in confidence," he said, "if you'll allow." "Of course," said the traveller, and listened with lowered eyes. "This procedure and this execution, which you now have an opportunity to admire, currently has no public supporters in our colony. I am its sole defender, and the sole defender of the former commandant's legacy. I no longer have the leisure to devise elaborations or refinements of the process. It's all I can do to preserve it as presently constituted. While the old commandant was alive, the whole colony was full of his supporters. I may have some of his persuasive gift, but I don't have his authority, and therefore his supporters have melted away. There are still plenty of them around, but no one will admit to being one. Today, an execution day, if you were to go to a tea-house and listen around, you might hear only ambivalent opinions expressed. They are all supporters, but given the current commandant and his current views, they are completely useless to me. So now I'm turning to you. Do you think it's right that purely because of this commandant and the women who dominate him, do you think it's right that such a life work," he pointed to the machine, "should be allowed to rot? Is that permissible? Even if you're just a stranger spending a couple of days on our island, there's no time to lose. Procedures are already afoot against my justiciary authority. Consultations are held in the commandant's office, to which I am not invited. Even your visit today strikes me as typical for the situation. They're cowards, and they prefer to send you, a foreigner. How different executions used to be. Even the day before, the whole valley was packed with visitors. Everyone came to spectate. Early in the morning, the commandant appeared with his ladies. The whole camp was woken by fanfares. I reported that everything was ready. The best people, not one senior official, was ever missing, stood around the machine. This pile of bamboo chairs is a pathetic memento of those days. The machine gleamed with polish. For almost every execution I availed myself of some spare parts. In front of hundreds of pairs of eyes, the spectators stood on tiptoe all the way up to those heights. The condemned man was laid under the harrow by the commandant in person. The work that today is done by a common soldier was in those days done by me, the president of the court, and it honoured me. And then the execution began. There were no discordant squeaks to interfere with the smooth running of the machine. Some of the crowd didn't even bother to watch. They lay there in the sand with eyes shut, but they all knew justice is being enacted. In the silence, nothing was audible but the sighing of the condemned man, muffled by the felt. Today the machine isn't able to get a stronger sigh from the condemned than the felt is capable of suppressing, but in those days the engraving needles exuded an acid which is no longer permitted today. Well, and then the 6th hour came around. It was impossible to find room for all those who wanted to view the proceedings from close to. With his typical insight, the commandant decreed the children should be given priority. Thanks to my job, I was always able to stand nearby. Often I would hunker down with 2 children either side of me, my arms around them. How we watched the transfiguration in their tormented faces. How we held our cheeks in the glow of his arduously achieved and already passing justice. I tell you, comrade, those were times. The officer had clearly forgotten who he was talking to. He had thrown his arms around the traveller and had pressed his head against his shoulder. The traveller didn't know quite what to do. Impatiently, he gazed past the officer. The soldier was done with his swabbing and poured rice porridge from a can into the little dish. No sooner had the condemned man noticed this, he seemed to have recovered himself. Then he put out his tongue and began to lap at it. The soldier kept pushing him away, because the porridge was supposed to be reserved for some time later, but it didn't make a particularly good impression either when the soldier reached in with his dirty hands in front of the hungry condemned man to help himself. The officer quickly recovered himself. I wasn't trying to move you," he said. "I know it's not possible to make those times comprehensible now. At least the machine is still working and speaking for itself. It speaks for itself, even if it's all alone in the valley, and at the end the body still lurches with the same unfathomably gentle fall into the pit, even if there are no longer, as there were then, hundreds of flies collected around the pit. Back then we had to put up a stronger rail around the pit, but it's long since collapsed."